This is a video in which I go over the CHIA ethical decision-making process, and I do it by going through a scenario called cursing at the doctor, which we'll go over in just a second. Just to let you all know, as I stated in the other video, this is the short version of working out the scenario with the CHIA ethical decision-making process. There is another video in which I take a little bit more time, actually a lot more time, to work out the scenario through the CHIA ethical decision-making process. So as I say in the short video, there is no scenario 1 available on my YouTube channel. That is actually something I discuss in class with my students when we go through the CHIA ethical decision-making process. This is the second scenario that sometimes we get to discuss in class, sometimes we don't. So without further ado, let's go ahead and move on to scenario 2. The patient you're interpreting for begins cursing at the doctor because they're upset with their medical treatment. They don't call the doctor any names, but they use a lot of profanity to express how upset they are. So in this scenario, we're going to assume that we have an ethical dilemma. We'll get into that in a few moments here, but this is our ethical scenario, and we're going to be using the CHIA ethical decision-making process. So this is just going to be a really, really quick run through of that process. So the first step is to ask questions to determine if there is a problem. Once I go through these 6 steps and just tell you what they are, we're going to actually work through this ethical scenario. So for now, I'm just going to list the steps of the process. So ask questions to determine if there's a problem. Then next, we have step 2, which is the only step that has 2 parts. Part 1 of step 2 is to identify and clearly state the problem. Part 2 of step 2 is to consider the ethical principles that may apply and rank them in applicability. Step 3 is to clarify personal values as they relate to the problem. Step 4 is to consider alternative actions, including benefits and risks. And step 5 is to choose the action and carry it out. Step 6 being the final step, you evaluate the outcome to consider what might be done differently next time. So this can be a pretty difficult to remember process considering it's so wordy and there are 6 steps. And one of those steps has 2 parts, which is step 2. So I've also made another video in which I kind of go through different ways that you can memorize this process. But for now, we're going to work on our ethical scenario, which again, scenario 2. The patient is cursing at the doctor because they're upset with the medical treatment. They're not calling the doctor any names, but they use a lot of profanity to express how upset they are. So the first step, as we've determined, is to ask questions to determine if there's a problem. We're just going to go ahead and, what questions would we ask here? What's a problem? What is causing us issues in this scenario? Well, the issue that a lot of folks have is that, using bad words at a doctor or in the presence of a doctor is considered to be unprofessional, but at the same time, we're supposed to interpret everything. So we do have some things that are in conflict here. We're kind of, in some cases, some people are torn between which action to take. So we're just, again, for the sake, even if you think there isn't a problem, we're just going to assume for the sake of working through the scenario that there is a problem, and we're going to move on to step 2. Step 2, identify and clearly state the problem, considering the ethical principles that may apply and ranking them in applicability. So part 1 of step 2, identify and clearly state the problem. So this is where I would suggest if you'd like to work this out yourself, go ahead and pause the video, try and see if you can't clearly state the problem, and then come back and compare it maybe to what I have here. So this is what I wrote down that the problem was. So on the one hand, you're supposed to interpret everything, but interpreting profanity might offend the provider, might make you seem unprofessional, and lots of other bad things. So if you want to see this step played out in more depth, in more detail, you can watch the appropriate section of the longer version of this video. Part 2 of step 2, we need to consider the ethical principles that may apply and rank them in their applicability. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to take the 9 ethical principles as laid out by the CHIA'S, and then we're going to try and come up with our top 5, the top 5 ethical principles we feel relate to this ethical scenario. So the 9 ethical principles as laid out by the NCIHC are accuracy, confidentiality, impartiality, respect, cultural awareness, role boundaries, professionalism, professional development, and advocacy. So those are the 9 ethical principles as laid out by the NCIHC. So we're going to take those 9 ethical principles as laid out by the NCIHC, and we're going to pick our top 5. So we're going to try and consider which of these ethical principles do we feel relate most to this particular scenario, which are the ones that are the most salient. So again, this would be an excellent time to pause the video if you'd like to work through it yourself. But otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and show you how I ranked the ethical principles. First up, I put respect. It's just seen as disrespectful to use bad words in a professional setting, which brings me to the second ethical principle in my ranking, professionalism, because it's seen as unprofessional to use swear words. However, on the other hand, one argument for why we should be interpreting those bad words is the ethical principle of accuracy. So I really think that these top 3, you can put them in really any order you want, but generally speaking, it doesn't really matter what order they're in as long as you have them in your top 5. Number 4, I put impartiality, because impartiality is not only about your thoughts, biases, beliefs, and opinions, and not allowing them to interfere with the interpreted encounter. It also has to deal with taking sides. So if both you and the patient are cursing at the doctor, well, it looks like you're taking sides. Looks like you're ganging up on the doctor. And then the last one I put is role boundaries, because I feel like a lot of times in these types of scenarios, people like to kind of break out of that interpreter role and maybe start being a mediator and being other things that they shouldn't be. So this leaves us with our top 5 ethical principles from the NCIHC as they relate back to this scenario. Now, whatever your top 5 are, I would say they should look pretty similar to what I have here. We're going to save those guys for later. So we finished step 2, meaning we're going to go to step 3. So step 3 is where we really consider, how does this make us feel? So if you want to consider your thoughts about this, now would be a great time to pause and go over that. Otherwise, Kelly's going to tell you how it makes her feel and why it matters. Personally, this may be a surprise to some of you, I swear like a sailor in my personal life. Don't judge me. This is a judgment-free zone. So in that case, you know what? Maybe I'm not going to be as sensitive as the other people in this scenario when it comes to interpreting bad words. And I also have to think that in terms of those ethical principles of respect, of professionalism, maybe it's seen as more acceptable to me because I find profanity a little bit more acceptable. Maybe it's less unacceptable in a way for me to use those bad words in a professional setting. So I just have to bear in mind how I feel. And like I mentioned in the longer version of this video, if you get any really big feelings coming up here, big values coming into play, you might really want to consider the role that impartiality is playing into your ethical ranking in step 2. But we're going to move on to step 4 because this is supposed to be the short video, not the long video. And we are going to consider alternative actions, including benefits and risks. So we're going to come up with a couple of different actions that we can take, and we're going to look at their benefits, their risks, their pros and their cons. And I especially like to look at how they relate back to those ethical principles that we established in our top 5 in step 2. But before we can bring in those ethical principles, we need to look at some actions first. So if you'd like to know why I came up with the actions that I did, definitely watch the longer version of this video. This is an excellent opportunity for you to pause the video if you'd like to maybe select, I usually say at least 3 different possible actions you can take in this scenario. So then we'll come back and we'll look at the ethical principles and we will assign them to the appropriate column, pros or cons. So again, pause if you'd like to come up with at least 3 alternative actions. But for now, I'm going to tell you what 3 actions I looked at. And if you want to see why, again, watch that longer video. So the first action that I came up with was, don't interpret the bad words. Because even when you don't do something, well, that is doing something, right? Then I like to choose the complete opposite. just interpret what is said. My third action that I look at in this example is to remind the patient that you must interpret everything. And I'll qualify this a little bit later. Just expand upon this action a little bit more, because I did end up finding it to be a little unclear when it came to ranking the pros and the cons. So what actions did you choose? Did you choose the same actions? If not, be sure to let me know in the comments. Now, this is, again, an excellent time to pause if you would like to assign your ethical principles, your top 5, to one column or another. Your top 5 may be slightly different from mine. But if you would like to hear about how I ranked mine, you can go ahead and listen on. Otherwise, I would suggest pausing so you have a chance to work through this yourself. So when it comes to respect, I put respect in the pros column when you don't interpret the bad words, but in the sense that we're respecting the doctor. We're shielding the doctor from the bad words. We're not disrespecting the doctor by using those bad words. However, what might be respectful to the doctor, I thought was actually disrespectful to the patient. So again, if you want to hear a detailed explanation of this, you can watch the longer version of this video. For now, I'm just going to kind of go through the ethical principles and how I put them in each column. Professionalism, I put in the cons column because you're not really being a professional interpreter if you're not interpreting something. In terms of accuracy, I also put that in the cons column. You're not really being accurate. I also put impartiality in the cons column because in a way you're taking sides. And I also put role boundaries in that cons column because if you're not interpreting, are you being an interpreter? Then our next action, we're going to reload our ethical principles, our top 5. And again, you don't have to rank this only in terms of ethical principles. You can include some other pros and some other cons, such as losing or keeping your job. That is one that many people like to consider. Totally valid, totally important. But in this case, I'm just going through the ethical scenarios for now. The ethical principles. So if we just interpret what is said, well, it might seem disrespectful to the medical provider. However, we are respecting the patient in the sense that we're respecting their words and we're respecting their choice to use bad words. Because part of respect is patient autonomy, their ability to make decisions for themselves. Now, if you interpret what's said, it's probably going to seem or look unprofessional. However, well, part of being an interpreter, being a professional, is following the codes of ethics and standards of practice, in which case, one could make the argument that it is actually professional to interpret accurately and completely everything that is said. So that goes without saying that accuracy is honored here. Now, it might not seem impartial to the provider because, well, it's almost like you and the patient are ganging up on the provider. But you could certainly argue that you're staying within your role as a medical interpreter. You're not stepping out of that role, you're just staying in it. Reloading our ethical principles for our last action, remind the patient that you must interpret everything. So when I started working through this, I realized that I needed to make it a little bit more specific because, well, it really depends on the action that you take after you remind the patient that you must interpret everything. Do you interpret or don't you interpret? So I put here that, you switch to third person, you remind the patient that you must interpret everything. And in that case, in this particular example that we're looking at, we're not going to interpret what they said this time. So the assumption is that if they do it again or they say it again, that we will interpret what they say. But we're giving them a chance here to not say the bad words that we have to interpret. The reason why I did this, now by no means am I saying that this is the correct action or the incorrect action. This is just an action that we're looking at. I'm not saying that any of these actions are correct or incorrect, really. Just that we're looking at them to kind of compare them and maybe see what action might be better than the other actions that we have here on this page. So I just made it clearer so it would be easier to rank the ethical principles and more clear cut. So in terms of respect, I put here, this is going to be pretty similar to the first one. We're being respectful to the provider in the sense that we're not lobbing bad words at them. With professionalism, I put this in the cons column because in a sense we're admitting to the patient that we're not being professional. We're saying we have to do this and then you don't do it. That to me seemed unprofessional. When it comes to accuracy, you're again not being accurate because in this case you're not interpreting what is said. You're also sort of taking sides, and then you're also not sticking to your role as a medical interpreter. You're kind of mediating a little bit. So this is where I like to kind of tally, check and see how many pros and cons I have with each. So number 1, don't interpret bad words, has 1 pro, 5 cons. This is why I like to put them each on separate lines so they're easier to count. Just interpret what is said. We have 4 pros and 3 cons in terms of our ethical principles. And then remind the patient that you must interpret everything. Don't interpret what they said this time. 1 for pros, 4 for cons. So that concludes step number 4, but the next thing that we're supposed to do is to choose an action and carry it out. Obviously, we're not in the field right now, so we can't really choose something and do something, but we're going to at the very least choose an action here. So we obviously want to choose the one with, in this case, the least amount of cons and the most amount of pros. Sometimes it's not this easy and clear cut. Other times we might have, even though our ethical principles are supposed to be weighed equally, sometimes some ethical principles may weigh heavier than others, such as in instances where the patient's health and well-being may be at risk. But for more on that, I would watch the more lengthy version of this video. So we can tell here that option 1 is pretty much out, to not interpret bad words. Option 3 is also out because it also is tied for the least amount of pros, although it has the second least amount of cons. So we're going to go with just interpret what is said. So that concludes step 5 in a way, because we can't really carry it out. So what we're going to do for step 6, where we're supposed to evaluate the outcome and consider what might be done differently next time, we're going to imagine what would happen if you did the thing, and we're going to see, I'm going to give you an outcome, and we'll see how we might be able to do something differently next time based on that outcome. So, the patient you're interpreting for begins cursing at the doctor because they're upset with their medical treatment. And we chose the action to just interpret what the patient says. And this is the provider's response. Excuse me? That kind of language is uncalled for. Are you saying the patient said that? You know what? I don't care either way. There's no reason for you to use such foul language. And this goes for you both. Uh-oh. Things didn't turn out very well. So sometimes you can even choose what is the best action and even objectively what is the correct action in some cases and still get a negative outcome. So this is where we look at the rest of the final step here. We consider what might be done differently next time. And so there are a couple of things that we should consider. We need to ask ourselves, okay, do both the patient and the provider understand that we're interpreting everything? Now, this is where some people go, well, if you gave your pre-session, they should understand. Well, we also need to recognize that sometimes, even if we give a pre-session, a perfect pre-session, people might not listen to it. Sometimes people are busy, right? They might not hear our pre-session, they may ignore it. So this is where those third-person interjections are really, really helpful to remind people of these things. That we have to interpret everything. But also, in addition to those interjections, those third-person interjections, I always like to be prepared to explain why I must do something, not just say that I have to. So here's an example of that interjection. And again, if anything here in this last step doesn't seem clear to you, I highly suggest watching that longer version of the video in which I go into more detail into this final step. But I'm going to give you some examples here of a possible interjection. So either after you have this outcome where the provider seems to feel offended by what you interpreted, or even before you interpret the bad words, really depends on the situation. And these are certainly 2 actions that you could look at again if you were to go through the ethical decision-making process again, or just repeat step 4 another time. You can say this. The interpreter would like to remind everyone that they must interpret everything accurately and completely, no matter the content of the message. I like to include that last part because sometimes people think that if something is too offensive or too vulgar that I won't interpret it. Listen, y'all. Not only am I not afraid to interpret those things, The codes of ethics and standards of practice also kind of support it, at least partially, which is why we need to weigh our ethical principles in these different scenarios. However, saying this is just kind of like saying, well, I'm doing it because someone told me to. It's not really even giving a reason. So sometimes, especially if a provider, I like to anticipate responses. Sometimes providers say things like, well, the interpreter last time did it or didn't do it. I do like to sometimes add in certain scenarios, as per the medical interpreting codes of ethics and standards of practice. Because then they get that, okay, it's not just me doing it on a personal preference basis. This is actually something established that is a standard. But again, I have other things to consider. I have other things that I do consider in the lengthier version of this video when it comes to this interjection. And by no means am I saying that this is the only solution. This is just one possible solution, one possible way to consider this. You can always comment if you have other things to consider, other suggestions. They are more than welcome. And I look forward to seeing how you all work out this scenario as well.